Why did the Industrial Revolution happen in Great Britain and not in China? How did European countries close the gap with the United States after World War II? And why did it take so many years for the personal computer and the internet to make us more productive? These questions are all part of the conundrum that has preoccupied economists for centuries. Why do some countries innovate and grow while others stagnate? You will not be surprised to learn that this large and complex challenge has spawned many theories. For example, the Industrial Revolution in England depended not just on clever inventions like the steam engine, but also on the existence of a political class willing to resist the groups in society who were threatened by this radical new technology. The Soviet Union's centrally planned economy was surprisingly well suited to implementing electrification, at least for a few decades. The development of the internet in the United States depended in part on American trustbusters who broke up AT&T, the telecom monopoly, as well as, of course, the freewheeling startup culture of Silicon Valley. These lessons are of more than just historical interest. That's because we are now confronted with artificial intelligence, AI, a powerful and potentially revolutionary innovation which raises a whole host of new and urgent questions. Will AI deliver the productivity benefits that its advocates promise? And crucially, when will it do so? Will it earn a financial return for the tech companies which are pumping hundreds of billions of dollars into data centers and advanced chips? And will the US or China dominate this new technology as they are both trying to do? So this week on The Big View, we're going to talk about innovation and growth. It's what we do at Reuters Breaking Views. We tap our best sources around the world for fresh insights into the biggest stories in finance, business and economics. I'm your host, Peter Thalassen. And to talk all this through, I've invited Carl Benedict Frey onto the show. Carl is the Dieter Schwartz Associate Professor of AI and Work at the Oxford Internet Institute and the Oxford Martin City Fellow at the Oxford Martin School, both at the University of Oxford. He's written extensively about innovation, technology, and AI, and he's just published a detailed and fascinating new book called How Progress Ends: Technology, Innovation, and the Fate of Nations. Carl Benedict Frey, welcome to The Big View.
Good to be with you.
So I want to start with a question about how people experience big technological leaps when they happen. I mean, we are currently living in this era where every day people make extraordinary claims about the capabilities of artificial intelligence to change our lives, both for good and for bad. If you go back and look at, as you have, I guess, the arrival of the steam engine or electricity or the internal combustion engine, how good have we been in the past about understanding and anticipating the changes that will subsequently take place?
Well, if you had gone back in time and, asked my great-grandmother, what do you think that your grandchildren would do for work? She would probably not have said that my great-granddaughter is going to be a software engineer and my grandson is going to be a hot yoga instructor. So we haven't had that level of foresight. But at the same time, people living through technological change have, experienced that quite significantly in their daily lives. And so people that lived through the first industrial revolution, for example, that found their jobs being replaced by the mechanized factory, well, they famously rioted against the first industrial revolution, against the mechanized age. But that's quite different, I would say, from what we experienced in the 20th century with the internal combustion engine and electrification, partly because those technological changes didn't primarily center on automation. They created new and previously inconceivable products and industries, right? So the automotive industry was the largest industrial enterprise the world had ever seen. It created a host of supply industries that to make the component that went into the automobile. It created a host of industries that produced the machine tools to make the components. It created new jobs in road commerce, in tourism, in many other things, right? And then obviously, if you go into your home and you look at most of the gadgets that you have in your kitchen, for example, they also date back to that era of electrification. So people during this time was naturally very excited about technological change. And unfortunately, I think with the computer revolution and now artificial intelligence, we're a little bit back where we were in the first industrial revolution. Many people are worrying about their jobs. Many people have seen their incomes come under pressure from industrial robots and other related computer-aided tools. And so I sense that we don't have the same excitement about technological change today as we did in the mid 20th century.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, the other thing that really struck me about reading your book was that I get generalizing massively, but that these innovations come along and they don't really get sort of spread through the economy very quickly. I mean, you have this incredible statistic, I think, which is that the sort of the benefits of of electricity and the combustion engine, which were invented in the late 19th century, didn't really arrive until in terms of in economic terms until starting in the 1920s. So I guess that's the other sort of aspect of this, is that people maybe exaggerate or assume that new technologies get adopted very quickly when in fact it takes a long time.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Right. So the early steam engines, they were only used to drain coal mines, and even that they didn't do particularly well. They
Yeah.
were extremely coal inefficient, and it took James Watt's separate condenser for steam engine to become commercially viable, and then various tweaks for it to be adopted to road transportation, railroads, steamships, steam cars, and other things. And similarly with electricity, it takes around 4 decades from from Edison's Pearl station being set up in New York City uh, to actually the consequences of electricity showing up in the productivity statistics. And again, we see same similar pattern with computers, right? And so, yes, a key theme of my book is that these things take longer to happen than you think. And sometimes you can, wait forever, right? And so the book is a little bit of a pushback against this narrative that, technological change is inevitable. If it was, the Industrial Revolution would have happened a bit earlier in human history.
Mm.
If it was, most places around the world would have adopted modern technology and would be rich and prosperous as a consequence. And so clearly, just the fact that we're inventing these new tools and um, technologies doesn't necessarily mean that they will be adopted and put into widespread use.
Well, that's right. And I mean, if anything, I think one of the things that comes across very clearly is that even the invention is not necessarily inevitable. It's not it's not in the stars. I mean, you talk, for example, about the invention of the internet, and the precondition for that was the breakup of AT&T, the US telephone monopoly. And you have this sort of thought experiment, which is if they hadn't broken up AT&T, or if the invention of the internet had happened a bit earlier, probably would have been buried somewhere at AT&T and never really seen the light of day.
Yeah, I mean, few people saw the internet as a commercially viable technology in its early days, right? It was mainly used for collaboration among academics, and that's how what it was set up for. And so AT&T, I think, would almost certainly have bottlenecked the internet in its boardroom had it still existed
Mm.
once the National Science Foundation released it into the world. And obviously, in the US, that's one of many bottlenecks. But in some economies that are much more centralized than the United States is, you can have that across the board, right? So if you take the Soviet Union, for example, if you were an aircraft engineer, you come up with a new engine, you could go to the Red Army, ask it for funding. If they declined, maybe you had one or two or three at most other options. And if they decline too, well, your idea would die with you. And obviously, in such a centralized economy, you could only hope to get something funded which fit the national priorities anyway, and which meant that just the fact that the Soviet government set the priorities meant that people only worked in a certain direction and prioritized mostly military and heavy industry related technologies. Whereas, for example, in the United States, Bessemer Ventures famously turned down investing in Google back in 1999.
Hmm.
Now, you know, you can think with the benefit of hindsight that that was not the best of ideas and not to invest, but and it wasn't. But it also underlines the fact that it wasn't a sure bet back then, right? Alta Vista and Explorer had fairly dominant positions in the market, but the fact that Bessemer Ventures didn't invest didn't prevent the rise of Google because there were others that were happy to step in and fund. And that's, the benefit, I argue in the book, of a more decentralized system of finance. You can explore more technological trajectories. And so, in this sort of exploration phase, decentralized economies tend to have an advantage. But obviously, as the Soviet Union showed us, you can, through centralized planning, mobilize resources extremely well. You can scale up and you can do well in some priority sectors like the military.
Yeah, well, that's one of the interesting sort of tensions I think that runs through this whole story is that there are times when a sort of more decentralized, more sort of laissez-faire kind of approach is decisive and successful. But that's not necessarily always the case, because obviously, if you listen to the people in Silicon Valley or whatever, they would say that's the solution to everything. You must always have a free for all. But what you're saying is actually there are other times when, in order to really implement those technologies or to get the benefits from them, you need a bit more central planning. Even the US had that, I suppose, right?
Well, certainly so. And so post war growth in the United States relied to a large degree on state capacity, on building highways to exploit the automobile revolution, on creating educational institutions like the GI Bill to educate veterans to become professional managers and civil engineers and other things that firms required for scaling. And so United States has historically, as I pointed in the book, been very good at adjusting its institutions to new challenges, right? So back in the 19th century, innovation primarily came from independent inventors who traded their ideas in the market for technology. Most firms, whether it was DuPont or AT&T, um, um, they essentially focused on buying up technologies from independent inventors and
Mm.
then incrementally proving them and scaling up and bringing those technologies to market. And that eventually gave a rise to the era of mass production, and we saw that peak of that in the post-war period when much of the productivity gains from these new discoveries in electricity and internal combustion engine that were made by independent inventors in the 19th century, when they were finally exploited at full scale. But the returns to those inventions then eventually petered out, and then you needed something new to come along, and that was the computer revolution. And I point out that in the book that quite similar to today with the rivalry with China, there was a lot of concern in the 80s, in particular, that Japan would overtake the United States and become the predominant technology leader of the world. And Japan was outcompeting the United States in hardware, similar to what it done to cars with lean production a decade earlier. And but it completely missed the shift into software. And I think the United States proved to be much more flexible in part because of more vigorous antitrust, which meant that IBM was forced to unbundle hardware and software, opening up the market for Microsoft. And as we discussed earlier, with AT&T as well, breakup leading to the commercialization of the internet.
So I definitely want to come back to the antitrust question because obviously it's very relevant at the moment as well. But just before we do that, it seems like we're in an era now once again where governments are being much more involved in all aspects of the economy, but also in business and markets. Obviously, the U.S. government is now a 10% shareholder of Intel, or will be at some point soon. Governments are designing industrial policies and stuff. I wonder how you sort of think about that, because again, the slightly simplistic approach would be to say, well, this is always a disaster. It never works. Governments can't pick winners. But obviously there have been periods in history where government intervention has been quite decisive in terms of, not necessarily maybe in terms of inventing technology, but in terms of sort of applying it. So how would you think about that tension at the moment?
So the point I'm trying to make in the book is that decentralization versus centralization, as discussed, is not just a sort of question of state versus market, right? So we have a decentralized system of universities, for example, which are funded to a very large degree through public funds,
Mm.
and that decentralized system of universities was fundamental to the functioning of ARPA, right? And so program managers that
ARPA, just explain briefly what ARPA was or is.
so ARPA was an agency set up to counter the Soviet challenge and develop breakthrough technologies. And inside ARPA, you have project managers running different projects, and they giving a great deal of leeway in recruitment from American universities and a lot of autonomy in terms of choosing collaborators, in terms of projects being pursued. And so this decentralized system of universities was fundamental to the development of what became the internet, for example, right? And that's very different from, let's say, industrial policy that is geared towards, picking winners or picking industries, or favoring one mature industry over another. And it's certainly very different from the government taking shares in private companies. And so
Yeah.
when we talk about industrial policy, we tend to focus more on shifting the industrial composition of a society, and so it's more later stage than funding basic research, which most people will agree is something that the government should do. But to your point of does industrial policy work or not? So there's no question that Japan, Korea, China pursued industrial policy. There's no question that those countries grow very rapidly. There's also no question that many Latin American economies pursue industrial policy with the opposite effect. And so part of that might be the type of policies that they pursued. So Latin American economies pursued more import substitution, whereas East Asian firms focused more on export-led growth. But I think it also, to a very large degree, depends on the capacity of the state to actually implement policy. And what all East Asian economies have in common is a very long tradition of a highly institutionalized meritocratic civil service. And if you're a personal autocracy, most industrial policy initiatives have been a disaster, right? Because it's the nephew that gets to implement the project, and not somebody who's selected on the basis of the competence. And for the most part, I would say most successes have been in relatively mature technology fields, such as rolling out speed rail in China, for example. It's hard to think of much sort of in terms of cutting edge innovation that has come out of it, even in China. There, struggle to think of any major drugs that have come out of China, any major breakthroughs in artificial intelligence. But they've been very good, much like Japan, to take the 0 to 1 innovations from the United States, incrementally improving upon them and reducing costs very rapidly.
What about, just made me think what you were talking there about ARPA. I mean, how important has sort of geopolitical rivalry been in either kind of pushing or interfering with technological progress and with rolling out technologies? Because clearly we're back in an era of geopolitical rivalry, and AI and Nvidia chips and all these things are absolutely at the center of that whole debate. Do you see that as being a sort of a brake on progress, or potentially also maybe a stimulator of new developments?
So historically, I do think that geopolitical competition has been a driver of reforms that have mostly benefited technological advancement, whether it's the institution of meritocratic civil services, because you are likely to win wars and you're unlikely to grow unless you have the best people running the country. And you can see that, from, the Stein-Hardenberg reforms in Prussia, which were instituted as a response to defeat by Napoleon. You can see that in the response to Crimean War, leading to reforms in Tsarist Russia, but also actually in Britain. You can see that, in Korea, where catch up on the park became General Park, became uh, 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 absolute must to respond to the challenge in the north, and similarly made Japan in response to uh, Paris black ships. And so, yes, geopolitical competition have often spurred reform, and that has translated into progress. But you can also, learn the wrong lessons from that. And so, if there's something in China that's not worthwhile copying, for example, it would be public ownership. And so it's absolutely clear that publicly owned firms in China are the least innovative, least productive. The advantage China has is, taking technology and scaling it rapidly, and having a state that's able to roll out infrastructure at staggering pace.
But this is an interesting thing, which is something that we've discussed on this show before with previous guests. Is that does also seem to be this question, particularly from the US perspective, which is we, this idea that we have the technology and we need to stop others from getting it, but which arguably is true of advanced AI chips and things like that. But if you could turn that around and say, well, the Chinese seem to be better at building electric cars than anyone else, and that's a whole separate debate about whether that's sustainable and so forth. But I guess the rivalry also potentially would potentially get the US into a situation where it's resisting a new technology that might be better because it's coming from China.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, what you can learn potentially from China is that in the fields where China's been successful, there's vigorous competition, right? And so in China, you have this major economy with provincial governments competing against each other, and they're competing for promotions inside the party. And the way of getting ahead is to attracting technology firms and spurring growth locally. And so you have very vigorous competition in China, and in domains where you see significant progress, like EVs or in solar or in AI. There is very vigorous competition, right? So, the Chinese example is not one where you have one monopolist and you're propping up this national champion in order to try to get ahead of foreign competitors. China has an extraordinarily large internal market, and so even if they are erecting some barriers for foreign firms to compete, competition is still very significant within China.
But I guess what I'm asking more is sort of is to what extent are those are I mean, I take your point about the innovations that have come out of China, but if we take things like electric vehicles, how do you see how do you see the path of that kind of technology from is there a path whereby that technology spreads elsewhere, or is there a risk here that other countries, because they're worried about China, basically end up not adopting what might be a better technology?
So back in the 1980s, we had a similar concern, right? And the concern was around Japan, right? And Japan was outcompeting the United States in almost every conceivable domain, from cars to semiconductors, right? How did American firms respond to that? Well, they essentially responded by offshoring parts of production to Taiwan, Hong Kong, and China, and thereby undercut Japan's production advantage. And so the development of these global value chains is a response to that. And now we're seeing some of the consequences of that in geopolitical terms. And I would think that rather than trying to reshore production to the United States, where it's just much more expensive to produce, people don't want manufacturing jobs anyways. And there's a reason that firms offshore these activities to begin with. What you want to is friendshoring and diversifying your supply chains, right? So from a geostrategic viewpoint, clearly you don't want to be too dependent on your peer competitor. But a key advantage that America has had for the past couple of decades is that it's been integrated into the global economy to a degree that no other country has been. It's able to dictate terms within that global economy, and it's been to benefit for American technological leadership. So the prime beneficiary of the computer revolution, besides China, has been the United States, which has seen the most rapid productivity growth of any advanced economy since between particularly 1995 and 2004, when the computer revolution took up, and certainly stronger productivity growth than Europe since then too, right? And so to say that this has not been in America's interest, I think is borderline absurd in economic terms. Yes, there are geostrategic concerns, and those are best solved through diversification.
Yeah. I want to come back to you talked about antitrust earlier, which is obviously a very important part of all of this. And again, the sort of the massive simplification would be to sort of say, well, we've had these waves of innovation, new sort of companies emerge, dominate industries, and then particularly in the US, but elsewhere too, the sort of, or maybe to a lesser extent in some other places, but particularly in the US, then there's been a sort of reaction to that, and then these companies have been broken up, and then the whole sort of dance begins again. But we're talking in the week where US judges just basically rejected the US government's request to break up Google. China seems to be, the Chinese authorities seem to be doing their utmost to encourage companies not to compete with each other too vigorously. And so I wonder how do you sort of assess the state of sort of antitrust policy at the moment, and how that then flows through into future innovations?
So if you take the 5 largest firms by market cap in the United States, they are roughly 40 years old on average, and they're all in technology. If you do the same exercise in Germany, they are roughly 140 years old, and they are artifacts of the second industrial revolution. In France, they're of similar age, they're mostly luxury goods, and you can run through European country after European country, you see the same pattern.
Mm.
So a key feature of the United States has been its relative dynamism. The fact that we have successive waves of technology creating new kind of some firms, and what you see in the 1980s and 1990s is that basically every company from Microsoft and Apple to Google and Amazon, they exit via IPO and listing on the stock market, becoming companies in their own right. Since the 2000, you see, however, that more and more firms, whether it's YouTube or Instagram, exit via acquisition.
Mm.
And so, I think we need to think carefully about how we can reverse that trend. And I think, part of that is probably merger review. Part of it is probably reducing reporting burdens on firms that go public. And so, you know, I don't know what the right, remedy to Google is, or to, various individual cases, but I do know that we need to look at the policy tools to tilt that balance, because we've seen a significant decline in startups being created. We've seen a significant decline in the growth of startups. We see more inventive talent clustering in incumbent companies, and we see that inventive talent is less inventive working for those incumbents than they were at the smaller firms or the startups where they previously worked. And so the United States today has a dynamism challenge, and to keep the lead, the United States needs to stay dynamic.
So how should we then think? That's very interesting. But how do we then think about that in the context of AI? Because what seems curious, one of the many things seems curious to me about AI, is that this is sort of it's a technological revolution from above, right? I mean, the amounts that are being invested are so vast that really there's only a handful of very large tech companies that can afford to make these investments, and they're in this incredible arms race where they're trying to hire each other's people and offering hundreds of millions of dollars to AI researchers and so forth. But it's not. I mean, you talked about Google earlier. It's not, two university dropouts in their dorm room creating a new business, which then kind of storms the ramparts and displaces existing companies. It seems very much driven by established companies trying to become even bigger and more established. So I don't know, how do you sort of fit that into, given the history that you've looked at, how do you fit that into that sort of story?
So I think if we had had this conversation 5 years ago, we would say that Google and Meta
Mm.
look much more secure in their market position than they look today, right? And it's important to remember that all the people that developed the transformer and the architecture underlying the large language models, they were at Google and they subsequently left. And so it seems that Google was actually still quite inventive, but people couldn't do much because generative AI risked undermining the existing business model built around search.
Mm.
Right now, the a bit of good news is that competition among foundation model providers actually looks pretty strong. And so there are numerous providers, some of them are open source, and it seems that financial markets are doing a pretty good job in actually letting smaller companies be able to compete despite the very high capital requirements that you mentioned. I do strongly think, however, that the path forward is not just scale. So we're not going to get much progress just by scaling up existing models. And I think, reasoning tests like, ArcAGI2, for example, shows that you need something else. And decentralized system have the advantage of being able to explore different technological trajectories. And so I think it's vital that we maintain uh, high levels of competition. And I think it's vital to keep an eye on, some of these partnerships we see emerging, and um, make sure that that's not becoming a barrier to entry. And also the fact that many incumbent technology firms have taken significant stakes in some of the startups, AI startups that are developing. And I think that's something that the competition authorities need to keep a close eye on as well.
Yeah. Um, Towards the end of the book, you say something quite striking. You say the US and China appear to be on a path to stagnation, which is quite surprising given the sort of the general discourse about AI and all the upheaval that's going to come with it. I, I just wonder how do you sort of reconcile those two things?
Well, it's a bit of a puzzle is that, since the 1980s, we've had this extraordinary upsurge in patenting in inventive outputs, but we don't see it in the productivity statistics, right? So in the United States, we see sort of brief upsurge in productivity growth during the computer revolution, petering out around 2004, and then being quite disappointing since then. In China, by some estimates, productivity turned negative after the Great Recession, and it's been, very disappointing over the past decade. And obviously, China has its own problems. The real estate sector is a third of the economy by some estimates. And so, despite this, AI rivalry narrative, we're not seeing it in the productivity statistics yet. And so, it doesn't really. The narrative of this AI race doesn't really fit the data. It's possible that we will see a productivity revival down the line. But it's been a couple of years since generative AI was released to the world, and we still haven't seen the benefits materialize. We started off this conversation by saying that it often takes a long time. In this case, uh, however, with existing infrastructure, people can get access to these apps instantaneously. And so the rollout of complementary infrastructure, well, it's happening, it's needed. We see a lot of capex going into building data centers, but people can, have it on their phones within the next minute, if they like to. And so I think the problem is right now that, all the applications that I see around AI are very much focused on automation. And, productivity tools by themselves, somewhat paradoxically, don't usually give big boosts to productivity, right? So think about it this way. If all we had done since 1800 was automation, we would have productive agriculture and cheap textiles, and that about it, right? Wouldn't have vaccines, antibiotics, computers, rockets, airplanes, etc., right? So most growth, most progress come from doing new and previously inconceivable things. And unless we do that, we're not going to see huge improvements in um, um, material standards. Now, we are seeing some promising applications in drug discovery, which are noteworthy, and I'm actually quite optimistic in that particular sector, but that's not going to lead to the broad-based productivity growth that we saw during the post-war period.
Maybe this is just a good place to finish up because I mean, obviously, you've done a fair bit of work on the whole question of the jobs that can be replaced by technology, by automation, and by AI, and which professions might be vulnerable. And so would you say that you're sort of surprised that this hasn't gone faster?
Yes and no. So
Right.
obviously, we did a paper back in 2013 where we, estimated the share of the labor market that's most exposed to automation. And so some of the occupations that are at most risk, according to our estimates, are in transportation and logistics, and so exposed to autonomous vehicles, where there has been noteworthy progress, but the rollout has been slow. It's confined to a few cities in the United States and China for now, but I think it's still likely to happen. So yes, I've been somewhat surprised too. I thought that would have happened faster, but obviously with generative AI, some things have been happening. You know, faster than anticipated. So we anticipated, for example, that fashion models would be exposed to AI. Some people laughed us out of the room for that particular prediction, and that looks like one of the things we got right. But didn't quite see the broad-based implications of that sort of generative AI in terms of the various types of contents it's capable of creating. So yes, I've been somewhat surprised by the speed of improvements over the past couple of years. I've also been somewhat surprised how little it seems to matter.
Mm. Yeah, yeah, and as you say, it's not yet showing up in the productivity statistics, but maybe it takes time. Carl, we're gonna have to leave it there. This has been absolutely fascinating. So thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us, and yeah, we'll come back and see how all of this played out at some point in the future.
I very much liked it. Good to be with you. Thanks for having me.
That's our show this week. Thanks to Carl for that great discussion, and as always, to you for tuning in. This podcast was produced by Oliver Taslich in London. You can listen to a new episode of The Big View every Tuesday on the Reuters app or your favourite podcast platform. Don't forget to tune into our sister show, Viewsroom, every Thursday, as well as the other great podcasts from the Reuters team. If you liked what you heard, please follow The Big View and let us know what you thought. And check out our views on the biggest stories in business and finance every day at breakingviews.com and reuters.com.